Welcome back to the Filmmaker and Fans podcast. In this week's episode, we explore the 2019 award-winning film Uncut Gems. Using Uncut Gems as our foundation, we explore topics such as the collaborative partnership between Adam Sandler and the Safdie brothers, the search for like-minded individuals who can challenge and stimulate the artistic process, and the rejection of orthodoxies in favor of experimentation and exploration. Hope you enjoy.
Back one of the first few episodes after a little vacation and getting things together, but I'm excited. I'm feeling good about this one, and I think we're starting off strong too. So we're gonna do Uncut Gems for this episode. So we'll get right into it. It's Uncut Gems. It was came out in 2019, starring Adam Sandler and Julia Fox, directed by the Safdie brothers, Benny and Josh. And the logline for this one is, with his debts mounting and angry collectors closing in, a fast-talking New York City jeweler risks everything in hope of staying afloat and alive. So I'm curious because we didn't do this in the first few episodes. So I think we'll start it off with you picked this one. We've kind of gone back and forth with lists for the next kind of handful of episodes so far, and this is one of yours. So I'm, opening it up. I'm curious why this one. It's a fantastic film, but from your side, why Uncut Gems for this episode?
Well, it is a fantastic film, and I watch lots of movies, and I've seen most of the tropes and the mechanisms and the devices and the structures. Rarely anymore in my life does a film come to me and alter my understanding of film completely. It made me rethink all my approaches to filmmaking, to character art, to narrative, to storytelling. It really is a masterpiece. I don't get a lot of attention. I don't know why it didn't get more attention than it did, because it's virtually a perfect film, full of complexity, incredible performances. It is first and foremost a thriller that has you on the edge of the seat the whole time, but it examines big and important notions about the transactional nature of most of our relationships, about what family is, about obsessive compulsiveness, about neurosis. It is just a fascinating film that works on so many different levels. Intellectual, highly entertaining at the same time. And the central performance by Adam Sandler, of course, I worked with a lot, is breathtaking to me.
Perfect. Let's start with Adam's performance then, if you want to. So let's dig in there. So specifically Adam's performance, and I want to kind of highlight and talk about that a little bit. But your unique kind of point of view on this whole thing is you've worked with Adam before. So Adam's role in this film, this character that he plays, it's a very complex and dramatic role. Now, as a writer, and specifically as someone who's actually worked with Adam closely, you were the DP on the Waterboy, and you've seen him shape those type of comedic characters up close. So you've been there when he was actually putting that type of character together. And then seeing him deliver this type of performance and this type of character. I think seeing the differences between those two types of characters are easy sometimes to see, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the core similarities when developing complex characters on kind of both sides of the comedic and dramatic spectrum.
Yeah. I did two movies with Adam and knew him for a long time. Really good person. Let me just say, one of these facilitators, not just a person who appears on camera and is charming or works well with others. He's a good leader. He facilitates people. He makes you feel part of something bigger than what is directly in front of you. So kind of inspirational. Waterboy was expected to be a moderately successful comedy. Of course, it broke all sorts of records. I think made $1 billion in the end, and it became kind of legendary. The first film, directed by Aaron Stickerson, not as successful, but still very entertaining, and really introduced me to the wonder that is Adam. Now, he's mainly known as a comedian, as you rightly say, and he does his shtick. There is a personality, persona that he acquires even on set that is a little bit impenetrable. But what is interesting is, because he's got so much else going on, he's a business person, he's a producer, he's a writer, there's all this subtext that you know is there, but isn't always ostensible. So when you recognize that his performance is a performance, and the person he's presenting you with isn't the person that he is, he becomes much more interesting. And that is very much the character he plays in Uncut Gems. He presents, he's constantly selling. He's always trying to manipulate others to get what he wants, because what he wants, that drive, is ultimately what defines him. It is a almost psychotic drive, a desire both to put himself at risk and then to obtain things that I guess he thinks may alter him. But it's pretty clear to us early in the film that nothing's going to alter him. So it is the hunger that defines him, not the subsequent meal that he may or may not have. And what's interesting about Adam is that it is this layering, be it a comedy or be it drama, is that he presents one thing, but that there's a great deal else going in terms of the subtext that you don't always understand. Now, Waterboy was a farce. There's a profound difference between farce and comedy. Comedy implies that you're dealing with real people. Farce implies that these people are pastiches, are not real people. They're exaggerated, and therefore we don't feel a direct and profound relationship with them. But remember, the center of Waterboy, there is an important dynamic that happens that with Bobby Boucher, is that he's sympathetic. He's a fool. He's a buffoon. He's an absurdist portrayal of a human being. But you build an empathic connection to him because he has these pitiable vulnerabilities. And Adam is wise enough to recognize that one of those things that builds empathic bridge is vulnerability. And he built it in Waterboy, I think, which goes to, in part, why that film is so successful. People may think that I'm elevating a film that isn't about complex ideas and making it more complex than it is. I'm only talking about his process and his creation of character as someone that has to build this connection with audience for the audience to find the comedy funny. If Bobby Boucher was not sympathetic, the film would not be half as funny. Same thing in Uncut Gems, in that this is a thoroughly, theoretically unlikable character. And we're told repeatedly that to make a successful film, your character has to be ultimately likable, even though there's a long tradition in literature of very unlikable characters informing and being at the center of important novels. There isn't really the same tradition in cinema. Usually the idea is that if your protagonist is unsympathetic, your film's going to fail. And yet what Adam pulls off brilliantly in this film is create a character that is unsympathetic, but because we know so much about his central dilemmas, his obstacles, his needs, and the complexity of his life, remarkably, he causes us to care about this unsympathetic character. And that's the central dynamic of this film, all built around Adam's transformative work.
Let's talk about, so staying on Adam a minute, but also like talking about his collaborators, so the Safdie brothers, the directors that did this film. I dug in a lot with interviews and kind of things leading up to this, and Adam talked a lot about them as a duo and as a creative kind of collaborative, and like how much he liked working with them and how well they worked together. And I was looking around, and it looks like they did even a short together after this. And then they're actually in production, according to the internet, on their second feature together. So I'm curious around creative collaborations, and you specifically as a filmmaker, because there's a lot of examples out there, like Christopher Nolan is one, Wes Anderson, where they find their people and they continue to work with them, right? Like directors and actors, and they find their core. So for creative collaboration, I'm curious what you look for in creative partnerships in kind of two different scenarios. One, project-based, like making a film like this and finding the right people to be involved in a singular film, but then also longer-term work as a creative, for like producer relationships or even certain crew, for example.
Yeah, when I was a cinematographer, I worked with essentially the same crew for nearly 15 years, same camera operator, same gaffer, same grip. A lot of my camera systems were the same. And there's a reason for that. You have a shorthand with them, which facilitates efficiency on set. It's also the creative shorthand. You may probably have seen the same movies, talked about the same antecedents, and can make reference to those things repeatedly by saying, like that film that we like, we can do it in this style, or like we did on another movie, let's do that Steadicam shot or that crane shot. And it's quicker. There's that. Also, it's very hard hiring crew. There's a lot of people out there. We're all freelancers. And when it's the interview period for a movie, you don't have a lot of time. Maybe you'll see 4 or 5 people. But then in a conversation, you've got to determine whether you are going to go into this crucible of tension and risk together. And it's terrifying. And it really reveals character or the absence thereof the minute the pressure begins. And if you've made the wrong choice, and I have made the wrong choice a few times in my career, then you're stuck together for an unreasonable period of time. Sure, you can fire them, but then you've got even less time to find a new person, and the new person may be worse than the last, and you create the disruption during the production because you've lost a key collaborator. So that's one of the reasons you stick with the same people. Now, I worked with a great commercials director, went on to make important features, Tony Kaye, the American History X, and others. And Tony would regularly turn crews over. And as he explained to me, I may have talked about it here before, one of the reasons Tony would do that is he would say he would learn something new from each person that he hired, that it creatively stimulated him to bring new people in. And rather than being stultified and using the same methodologies over and over again, there would be new methodologies and new approaches and new ideas brought in by new crews. So there's that argument to be made as well. As a director, I do have a bit of ensemble with some people, Spencer Garrett, others that I'll bring back regularly because I know what he'll deliver. And again, the same sense of what I had with the crew, a reliable set of hands, reliable set of skill sets. And Spencer's a great actor, and others I've worked with. Again, I could say the same thing. But as to the nature of collaboration, what I look for is not the person who can do the specific job, but the person who rather is philosophically aligned with me in my approach to film and filmmaking. So with actors, I won't do line readings. Rarely will I have them come and do a scene from the movie. I will with minor support roles sometimes. But really what I'm looking for is someone who is interested in putting the boat out, in taking creative risks, of feeling that the danger stimulates them. So will be inclined to want to do improv experiments with me, to do tons of backstory, to examine the nature of character, to think that nothing is set in stone. There's a plasticity to what we're creating, and let us do that together, and let us fail together and not be frightened of risks. And also, I'm interested in people who, again, are going to creatively stimulate me, who may have an entirely different approach to acting, to understanding of narrative, to their approach to the way they work on set, to the backstory that I give them. I gave John Malkovich tons of backstory, of course, on Dominion, and then he did his own research. So ultimately, what character John created was a hybrid of what I thought was what the character was and what he thought the character was going to be. But I love that there was a actor so dedicated to their craft that they were willing to do that additional research and bring something new to the film. Romola Gary on Dominion had a very different understanding of Catelyn Thomas than I did, and she felt very strongly about her view, particularly about the polemic and the representation of women and women from that period in film. And I am a male writer writing a woman character, so what she brought was challenging and new to me, and things I hadn't considered. And I have to say, at first I was objecting because it wasn't the vision I had for the character art of the film. But then by our exchanges, I came to an understanding that the character that we're creating together was better than the character that I would have created by myself, ultimately more complex, more nuanced, and with greater depth. So I think what Adam's going to with his collaboration with the Safdie brothers is this very thing, that they were going to go on a journey together. They were going to plunge to the depth of understanding of this character they were creating together. They were going to support him in the risks that he took. They were going to facilitate that. And then in the same way, they would say to him, we have this particular vision, which may have been different from his own, and therefore had stimulated him to be greater than he would have just been by himself. So that's what you look for. You look for other artists. So many people think that there's an algorithm, now that AI is so much part of our culture, for success. That if you have a happy ending and you have a pleasant and charming protagonist, and you have a 3-act structure with conflict and obstacles, and your charming character overcomes those obstacles, then your film will succeed. And because films cost so much money to make, all your investors, and you're dependent on your investors, want there to be an algorithm, which is why people are so excited about AI, I think. because the idea that someone else can make some of those complex decisions that you have to make in life, which are creative ones, things not based on existing structures or templates, but new templates, that seems very appealing. I don't think it's true. I think that as we create together characters, narrative, and anything else, there's a flexibility, there's a madness to it, there's a chaos to it, and we don't know what we're going to make before we make it. We pretend to, so we can reassure our investors and our studios and our backers, and we have some notional understanding of what our structure might be. But ultimately, remarkably and oddly, the process is where we discover what we're doing. It's not until we're doing it do we understand what we're doing.
So and we've talked about this a bit, or quite a bit actually, your kind of creative process and your approach to things, that comes from somewhere. So I'm actually curious where, and you've kind of pointed to areas where you've had projects where it didn't necessarily fit into that way of working. So, across the board, there are a lot of different approaches for directors and writers and just creatives in general to do the job and their ways of working. And like you said, it's about finding that and what works for you and your team. Do you have any stories, experiences, anecdotes, anything from earlier in your career where those things were forming for you that helped shape that preference for you of ways of working?
Yeah, I'm not a naturally intelligent or gifted person. Put me in a structure, an ordered structure, and I become anxious and will often fail. I'm not good at filling forms in. I'm not good at being mission specific and being told that I have to do certain things in certain ways. I lose attention and I feel that I'm going to fail. I feel that measured directly and fairly against another person, the other person will probably do better than I will. Whether that's true or not is not really significant. It's the belief that I've always had. So when I was in the UK and trained in a very regimented BBC system about ways of lighting, for example, with a key light that's at a 45-degree angle and 45 degrees up, and a fill light that's at eye level, backlight, and a separating light. And basically, you're supposed to light everything in this fashion, and it's perfectly acceptable, and it creates really good TV lighting, good feature lighting, and it was the orthodoxy. I didn't feel comfortable with it. And because I have found that the only way that I could succeed is by lateral thinking, and there's a philosopher that had a big influence in my early life called Edward de Bono, and created a philosophy called lateral thinking, which is that you don't think linearly, but when the options seem to be in a particular order or structure, think the opposite of that. Not necessarily because that's where your solution is, but it'll change the way that you think. And de Bono changed the way that I thought. And then I stumbled upon semiologists and structuralists like Roland Barthes and Christian Metz and others, who began looking at film differently, and by saying all films are codes, all films are languages. And language works in a particular way. You have an idea, the signified, and then you have symbols that you use in your films that will represent the ideas, the signifier. And signifiers can be simple and ostensible. A picture of a cow represents the idea of a cow, or they can be more complex, love, bigger philosophic notions, and how you represent them and how you get to the idea. So the signifier is the notion that you have in your head. The signifier is what you then ingrain in your film. So this juxtaposition, this combination of lateral thinking and semiology began making me look at all differently, and all of my work differently, which is say that I didn't feel that I would apply the orthodoxies, but if I did that, I would succeed. So I began lighting not from above, but from below, not using backlight, not using fill light, or not using any light at all, just lighting completely with backlights. The person was in silhouette. I was told that I should use a limited color range, but we had these things we used to call party gels. There's thousands of different gels, color gels you can put on lights. And I thought, why not light a face with blue lights? Because I'm told you can't light it. What effect will it have on the audience? If the blue light is the signifier, it is just a signifier. Why do we light with neutral light? That's also a signifier. Is all light the same? It's not. And I do know when I go outside in a phosphor vapor light at night, that has a color cast to it, or sodium vapor, whatever the light is, will be different. So I know the eye does a thing called local adaptation, that it adjusts to the color. And where there isn't white, it'll see the whitest thing as white, even though it's not white. So when we're inside, we think the light is neutral, but in fact, light inside is red. When we're outside, light is blue. It's not till we're inside looking out, we realize that the outside light is blue, or we're outside looking in, do we realize that the inside light is red. So when we're walking by some cottage at nightfall and we look at a window, everything seems golden and glowy inside. To the people inside, it's not golden and glowy, it's just blue outside. That's local adaptation. It goes through very often the way that we think, and our kind of perverse perspective on the world is we see the world that we're in as normal, as neutral. I hate the word normal most among all words. So I began experimenting not only with lighting from below, or changing all the orthodoxies or challenging them, because I felt more comfortable in challenging things than accepting them. But then I also began playing with colors, because my understanding of semiology would say that everything is gesture and encoding. There is no standard. Everything is about stimulating or creating ideas in your audience will alter the way they experience the world. So why not use different colors? And that's how I made my name in music videos and subsequent commercials, by my strange lighting techniques, in terms of both how I use color and then for the angle by which my key lights came. And then eventually it went into my features as well. Other cinematographers are doing much the same thing. Chris Doyle, doing remarkable work with Wong Kai-wai. But they're mixing light sources. What I was saying before about phosphor vapor lights, rather than correcting a phosphor vapor light to make it match everything around it, he would just leave it as it was. So then you have orange light mixed with blue light, mixed with green light. And then rather than adding fill light to make people look pretty, he would just use whatever light was available, or actually put a phosphor vapor light above someone's head, which everyone would say is a horrible light. It's a terrible color. But what happens in those films is that, a Chungking Express, is that you feel something viscerally entirely different than what you'd feel if it was just an ordinary, what I consider ordinary or normal representation of the world. Now, I then applied that philosophy to everything else that I did. I had great pleasure of being influenced by Mike Leigh early in my career. And again, another iconoclast saying the same thing about acting, that rather than using an existing script, why not let the actors collaborate with you? So Mike would go off and do these improvisational collaborations where the actors would live the roles for months, or with Sally Hawkins on Happy Go Lucky for a year. She became a supply teacher, which was a substitute teacher in the US. And she was going to play that character, so she would go and do it. And Eddie Marsden, who plays the driving instructor, actually became a driving instructor, and then would study the people around him, the argot, the language, the specifics of the way those people lived and spoke and interacted, and then come back to Mike, and they would speak about it, and they would evolve scenes together. That Michael was absolutely right. So there would be a script in the end, but it came from this collaboration with actors, very much like what John Cassavetes was doing, but in a different way. Cassavetes would improvise on set. My good friend Mike Ferris, talk about my team. Mike Ferris was my camera operator for probably 15 movies, 15 feature films. Mike Ferris, of course, was one of John Cassavetes' camera operators and cinematographers. And one of the reasons I bonded with Mike is my love of Cassavetes. So we would talk about Cassavetes all the time, and his approach to this plasticity of the medium, that don't know what you know going in, be open to what you can discover. Got someone like Jenna Rollins to work with, it's a good idea to be open to those things. And Mike would describe the chaos of the sets, that he would suddenly feel that they weren't getting where they wanted to go, and they would call rap at 11 o'clock in the morning. They would completely depart from the script and then have to change the script for the next day because the character had gone in a different direction. I wouldn't advocate that. It's an expensive way to make a movie, and Cassavetes created a special environment and financial structure. But I do improvise a lot with actors. I do alter things a lot. I do like to experiment with lighting, with production design, with editing. And then when you expose yourself to filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard as well, again, you start seeing this idea that there is no single orthodoxy or form. What matters is what works with audience, not what you're told will work. So when Godard suddenly puts up letters in the middle of a film, or suddenly has Godard appears in his own film talking to the audience in numero deux, this is significant because it works. And that's what I'm interested in. And then, of course, I've been interested in the other art forms for a long while. I'm interested in painting, poetry. And when you look at how other art works, you recognize that it's not just content, but it's also form. Look at the history of painting in the 20th century. It's not about how we can do classicism and the representation of the human figure better. It's about the abandonment of classical representation and getting into abstract expressionism, cubism, modernism, postmodernism, all that stuff, which there's a reason for that. I'm not saying that we should all be making postmodernist, deconstructed movies, but I'm still stimulated by it. I'm stimulated by the fact that it elicits a reaction by this idea of signifier and signified, our understanding of semiological analysis of art.
So this is, as always, just such a great segue into another area. I want to talk about narrative structure. This film is non-traditional narrative structure, the way that it is kind of unfolds and works, and it uses certain devices to help with this. And there's various subplots going on that you follow, and it creates this kind of narrative web. We've had so many conversations about your approach to narrative structure and your thoughts around traditional versus non-traditional and ways of working. So if interested, what I'd like to do is, for those that don't know, can you give kind of a snapshot of how we got here for the traditional structure and what we're told that we have to write stories in, specifically the 3-act structure, and then a little bit about how you approach it differently?
Right. Well, it begins with the financial model that films cost a lot of money. So right away, people who are investing lots of money, who are non-artists, want to know that there is some method by which you can take their money and make them more money. And if you say you don't know, you'll find it as you go, that's not hugely reassuring. So with the big studios, they wanted to find a method that they could rely upon. And then in the 60s, a little bit later, there began to appear the screenwriting gurus. And then also there was a parallel examination in the more accessible styles of popular philosophy about something called the hero's journey, and that all stories are based on this idea of what the hero was. And Joseph Campbell had a television program that was on PBS in the US, and this idea that all of our Western canon has this foundation in the hero's journey. The parallel examination screenwriting was this idea of 3 acts, and they based that on some understandings from Aristotle, that basically most of our cultural antecedents have a foundation in story. And story meant that we create a narrative where we mediate the world through a particular structure, that we have a person who we might find appealing, sympathetic bridge, is something we have in common with them. They have obstacles, as we all have obstacles. They have to overcome those obstacles. There are crises, there are stakes that increase that make the obstacles more difficult. And then they either alter their world, alter themselves, make some key decision. And then when even things seem insuperable, they somehow overcome them. And that's basically I'm doing it some injustice, your story structure. More importantly, this idea that there is a form that transcends all other things, which really comes from Plato. The great philosophic split in early Greek philosophy was this idea of form, whether form was divine and existed independently of our world experiences, or whether there isn't form. And if there is a divine form or semi-divine form or just something that exists in the universe that represents the perfect or the ideal, and that is held from us and we have to discover it or move towards form, then that goes to the Platonic understanding of the world, the story of the cave, that you see a representation on the wall of the cave of what is the ideal, which is outside the cave, which you don't have direct access to. And even though this comes from Aristotle, it's much the same notion that there is this ideal form that all people respond to. And what studios loved about it, writers loved about it was, oh, hang on, this is something ancient. And as you know, in California, something's ancient, it must be true. So when you say Aristotle, it seems like it has a profound foundation, something greater than ourselves. To the people who are giving money, the idea that there was a formula that would have a return more often than not gave them some surety that their investment was safe. For writers who were lost or inexperienced, the idea that there's a right way to do things was a great relief to them. And the fact that, meanwhile, Joseph Campbell and others were saying, yes, there are structures that this kind of Jungian idea that we're not even aware necessarily of why these things have this profound effect on us, but they do. So if you use these mechanisms and devices, if you have a hero on a particular journey and put in this particular structure, your audience is going to respond to it. Now, there's so much specious there that I can't really begin to examine. It doesn't mean that Joseph Campbell's not smart, very, very smart. It doesn't mean that Aristotle wasn't smart, but it doesn't mean they're right. The thing about the creative process is that we're trying to find ways to alter our audience's understanding of the world, their experience of the world. And that may be through using these classical forms. But I'm not sure that's the only way of engaging the audience, or even the most effective way. Otherwise, the progress we see in painting, for example, which is not based on the hero's journey, which is not based on Aristotle, would not have been as effective in the 20th century. And we got into just Impressionism, which something everyone has access to. Why, when the Impressionists trying to capture a moment in light and painting very, very quickly and without hard structured lines, why is Seurat or Monet or Van Gogh so powerful when we look at it without a narrative? So clearly something else is happening psychologically, that this understanding of everything in the world being narrative or story is missing. Same thing in music. Why is a minor chord particularly powerful and makes us sad? What else is happening there? Why in dance, which may or may not have a narrative, contemporary dance very often doesn't, why do we find the movement of the human body emotive and powerful? And why in film, when we deny the use of the three acts, when we have someone like Charlie Kaufman, for example, or Mike Leigh, or even the Safdie brothers, do these stories still work? And why are they still effective? And I would conjecture maybe more effective because they're not predictable. And I have a great problem with stories that are predictable, that if you make a film and within 10 minutes the audience knows how it will invariably end, then I think there's less interest in that story. But because this formula has become pervasive, and if you don't use it, projects may life. So it becomes self-serving to believe in the orthodoxy, because if you don't, you may not find someone to back your film or studio to release that film. But when people have experimented with other forms, it has been very effective, because one of the delights of good narrative is when you don't know where the story is going to go, because it's not using classical form. So in this particular film, in Uncut Gems, we see this strange character full of need and passions and neurosis, and we have no idea where it's going to go. Because he's not a classical hero, we don't presume he's going to triumph. Because he's being unfaithful to his wife, we don't think that he's inevitably going to get his reward, because he may not deserve a reward. And yet, what's fantastic about it is he has a particular goal, and we are rooting for him to achieve his goal. So I guess it's kind of like the hero's journey, but he's not a hero. So we don't know how it's going to end. And that's one of the reasons it's such a thrill ride, is we're thinking this guy could get killed, beaten up, arrested, murdered. We have no idea what's going to happen to him, because we know, and if we're not au fait with classical story structure or with Robert McKee or one of the key books about it, or with Joseph Campbell. It doesn't matter. Audiences have intuitions because they've seen so many movies and TV shows. And when a typical audience begins watching this and you ask them after 10 minutes, where's this film going to go? They have no idea. When you ask an audience in a Pixar film where it's going to go after 10 minutes, they have a pretty good idea. And they can probably tell you how the film's going to end, what's going to happen in the middle, what the obstacles are going to be, and how the thing's going to resolve. There's a satisfaction in an ordered and structured world where everything is predictable. I sometimes long for it because my world is so chaotic. My life reflects my art. But at the same time, when you're making a film that you really want to find engaging, I think it's probably better if the audience doesn't know where it's going to go. And one of the many virtues of this remarkable film is you have no idea where it's going to go.
And this is great for another part too. Another piece of this that feeds into all of this is the pacing of it. I mean, you've mentioned chaotic and the chaos already, and just the tension that's in this film is relentless on this pace. And it's actually I was reading a lot of critiques and kind of quotes and things in prep, and a lot of them mention anxiety and how people were feeling anxious watching this film just because of how it plays out. And again, you're with him the whole time and going through all these things with him in real time sequences. And for pacing, the Safdie brothers even use certain, call them devices or whatever, but to create that pacing, right? So these long takes, you're dropping them in this real time sequence and you're following him like indoors, in buildings, on the street, in different interactions. And it's just, you're right there. So pacing specifically, when we're talking about like non-traditional approach, this is just kind of a broad, easy one, but I'm curious where you are with pacing and how you approach pacing in projects or whenever you're plugging into things. Is it purposeful? Does it start on the page when you're writing? Is it something you find when you're shooting through devices? Like, how do you approach pacing?
It goes back to what I was talking before about the side of semiology, which is signifier and signified. I'm always thinking about where I want the audience at a particular time. So on GRQ, which has some similarities and was much influenced by Uncut Gems, I wanted the audience to be anxious some of the time. So what causes anxiety in, for example, an action film? Well, when we're mediating the world, in a car, for example, and we're going at 10 miles an hour, we look around, we see the pedestrians, we see oncoming traffic. Pretty calm. If that car is now going 150 miles an hour through traffic, the pedestrians we're nearly hitting, the approaching cars that are coming towards us, the train that may be approaching the track, these things are coming so quickly that what happens to us biologically is this fight or flight mechanism. We got to respond very quickly. We may hit something, we may have to make a turn, so we have to be ultra alert. The more you can disorient an audience, the more they become anxious, and the more excited they become, and in some ways, the more engaged. So in action films, we tend to edit very quickly, because if you think about when you're looking at a movie, you really don't know where you are. Right now, as we talk, you can see me in a room, single view as well, pretty easy. If suddenly I began swinging the camera and you saw someone else in the room with a knife over in the corner, and you see that outside Los Angeles has started to burn, and if you see that on my keyboard a message is coming in saying magic has happened, and we're cutting like these one after the other, suddenly you become anxious because there's so much more information for you to process and understand and orient than you had before. And also the angles are changing. And every time an angle changes, the audience has to take a millisecond to say, where am I now? And when something's coming towards you, where am I now when something's coming towards me? Oh, hold on, it's not real, I'm safe. And now you're at another angle. And now you have a loud noise. And loud noises also disrupt you. And now you hear someone saying something key from another room. And now you have more stimuli. And all the while, your brain is thinking, how do I process this? What's important? What isn't? Am I in danger? And cinema replicates that experience of the world, and in some ways does it better. It creates much more anxiety than very often we experience in the ordinary passage through the physical world. And that's significant, because if we're just telling a story and we think our only purpose is to tell a story, we're not thinking about how we can viscerally create a thing like anxiety in our audience. Because on the page, The person gives us some expositional information. I have to sell this gem to make money to pay for my house. Oh, I will buy it. I might not buy it. That's narrative, not really creating anxiety. Now, if suddenly you've got a handheld camera swinging from one person to another, if you have a really loud buzzer in the store that you work in, every time someone comes in, the buzzer goes off. If while you're speaking to one person, there's another thing going on in the same store that you're in, some other key sale, there's, say, a counterfeit watch that someone's selling that you are trying to put across as real, and they're starting to doubt that it's authentic. And that's going on at the same time that you're speaking to a famous basketball player and trying to sell them something, or they're asking to borrow something that's hugely valuable to you and not offering to give you any money for it, but you feel that you want to give them that. So now you, as an audience, are aware that the character is thinking about two different things simultaneously, and the camera's swinging it backwards and forwards. So you have to constantly reorient. It's creating anxiety. There's nothing on the page that creates that anxiety, because the page theoretically is just telling the story. The visceral elements of the film, the motion of the camera, the way it's edited, how quickly those edits come, the music, these things create things like anxiety. And as a filmmaker, as a good filmmaker, you have to be as aware of the rate structure. In fact, I would conjecture that because of the way mind works, the way the mind works, the visceral always comes first. What people who study this have discovered is that in the hippocampus and in the chemical mind, we've learned to respond very quickly to stimuli. You see a car coming towards you, and you're a pedestrian. You don't think, oh, there's a car. The driver may be drunk. I'm crossing the street. If a car hits me, it will probably kill me. I should get out of the street. It's not the way it works. What happens is the hippocampus releases the chemical mind, as they call the reptilian mind, and it says danger. And you've got adrenaline, and you jump out of the way before you even think. Later, you cognify, using your frontal cortex, what you just experienced. But if the frontal cortex kicked in at that moment, you'd be dead. And that's the way it is in film, is we want to stimulate that reptilian, visceral mind to create emotional responses to moments, and then later have the audience's frontal cortex analyze what just happened. But first, we want to create anxiety. We can create other things. We can be crying in an audience, crying in a moment that seems universally effective. The death of someone that we find appealing, a romance that's been denied. That's also visceral. It's not always narrative. We think it's narrative. We think we can create it in the page, but there's signifiers, going back to semiology again, that we can create and use that instantly elicit a reaction in the audience. So first they respond emotionally and subsequently intellectually. And that's what the Safdie brothers do so well, is they recognize that films aren't just about storytelling.
As far as topics and questions, that's what I have on my side. Is there? I thought we might do something a little different today, other than the trivia. I actually have a question from a listener for you specifically, if you're interested in something like that.
I am very much so.
So here is, and this one I think actually feeds really well into what we were just talking about. So this is from Charlie from Instagram, and he is curious. He says, as a multi-hyphenate, can you examine the impact of having multiple standalone skill sets in the filmmaking process, such as being a cinematographer, director, writer? And even as you're wearing one hat, say directing a film, how does your ability to wear multiple hats improve the quality of your work?
Really important question, and it goes to so much what we're talking about right now, which is if we see film as only storytelling, and so many people say, oh, I'm just a storyteller, film's a story, or it's a good story, then these other skill sets don't matter much. As a writer, I recognize that when I'm writing, I am in some ways limited in that I'm trying to express everything with words. Because I've been on film sets so often, I recognize that that's only a part of the film experience, and that I can't put everything in the screenplay that's going to be on the screen. So it means that I can write with an economy, because I know that that's only part of the movie. I also know that sometimes it's better when a character doesn't speak. some of the most powerful emotional moments in movies ever is when a character simply looks off into space and we don't know what they're thinking. And as writers, we tend to want to say what our characters are thinking because we want clarity and because the script is something that we use to sell our ideas. We want to make sure that a person reading it understands the story and how compelling the story is and why they should make it. But of course, we know our film will be more compelling because we're making use of cinematography. We're making use of editing. I've spent a lot of time in editing rooms, and I've worked with Chris Gill and others, some of the best editors in the world, and learned from them. Now, when I'm shooting, I'm always thinking about how it's going to be edited. I recognize that I don't have to have every part of a take perfect because I know that 3 takes down the line is something else that I found that would be useful because of my philosophic approach about how signifiers and signified work, with my belief that we work for that reptilian chemical mind as well as the intellectual one. I recognize how important music is, and I'm always thinking about music while I'm shooting, what music I'll be using. I also love the montage because I recognize that one of the wonderful things about film is this plasticity in that we press time. And if film becomes much more interesting and engaging, and to use that Jungian idea that somehow there's something primal about it, that when time is compressed, because that replicates the experience of the way our mind actually works rather than the way we'd like it to work. If we use Proust as an example, Proust, Swann's Way, and others implied that we have these 3 levels of consciousness. We have this dream consciousness where we're thinking about the future, the way that we'd like the world to be, or even that moment to be, which has no specific response to the way the world actually is, our dreams. Then we have our memories, which are like dreams, because we don't remember them wholly and we're not physically experiencing them anymore, but they're dream-like because we're drawing on our consciousness to replicate something I had a long time ago, but we're no longer there. So the future and the past live in this kind of dream consciousness, and we remember them or dream them in fragments. So we have this mixture of fragments, where we're dream conscious of the future and of the past and even at that moment. And then we have our physical experience of where we are at that moment, which is also fragmented because our perceptions are not always accurate. We may be drunk, we may be passionate, we may be angry. So all this fragmented consciousness blend together, past, future, dreams, the specific consciousness of that individual moment, which is flawed and inaccurate. And that's the way we pass through the world. But when we write a screenplay or make a film, we imply that there's this ordering of events that's linear. Then one thing happens, then another thing happens. There's motivation for it. There's logic to it. That's not the way our consciousness works. So why not, as a filmmaker, as an artist, replicate our real consciousness rather than the consciousness that we've told works best in film to possibly generate the greatest income for the movie, because people like narratives. We may use narrative, we may love stories, but we don't experience the world as stories. We impose story on our existence because we want there to be a narrative and an order. But our actual consciousness is way more disordered than the way most films portray it. And when, as filmmakers, we use the actual conscious experience of the world rather than the contrived one, can that be more effective? And I think that it is. So when a film becomes discordant and jumps from dreams to when it uses some words that pop on a screen, when we have the screen go black, when we have the director come and speak directly to an audience, people can think that's radical, but it may be closer to describe rather than using traditional methods.